All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I guess I'm the host of this show. We didn't really kind of totally decide on that. Me and Matthew here wanted to get together and just discuss philosophical approaches to God. Long story short, we were connected through email not long ago. In fact, before that, Matthew, somebody sent me an article of yours where I think you linked to my book or something, and I told them to thank you for doing that. And that actually turned me onto your work just a few days before we connected. So just kind of some interesting coincidences there. And I've really been enjoying it. You've got a great Substack. You're producing a lot of really interesting content on a wide variety of subjects. But today we just, I guess, wanted to jam on theism a little bit, I think, right? Isn't that that's a plan, isn't it? Yeah. So before we dive in, at least for my audience, tell us a little bit about yourself. I'm just curious kind of to see the general course of your own sort of philosophical history from my little bit of investigation. It seems like we have a number of similarities. I think I read somewhere that you had libertarian leanings and you were also a naturalist at one point, and that would have described me at some point. I also had very strong libertarian leanings and was an atheist at some point. So yeah, give us a little bit of background if you don't mind, Matthew.
Yeah, so I'm an undergraduate studying philosophy at the University of Michigan. The next year, I'm studying abroad at Oxford. Up until so I'm currently 20, and up until basically when I was 20, I was a pretty committed atheist. And in the last year, I've become convinced of theism by thinking through a lot of the philosophical arguments. For a while, my position on atheism was sort of like, okay, yeah, there are some arguments for theism, fine tuning and so on, but evil is really decisive, and it's sort of,
Right.
even though theism has something going for it, the problem of evil is just too decisive and makes it so that theism is not a viable option. But, in the last year, I've concluded, no, actually, theism, it explains a lot about the world. Yes, evil is a mystery to some degree, but there's sort of enough going for theism that it's enough. There are enough powerful arguments for theism that they're enough to collectively overpower the force of the argument from evil, which, to my mind, is one of the few arguments that really raises the probability of atheism. I genuinely don't think that there are very many particularly convincing atheist arguments. So it's just like whether all the theistic considerations are together enough to overwhelm the problem of evil, which I think it is. So I was an atheist, and in the last year I've become a theist. I also many years ago I was a libertarian. I think I still have some libertarian leanings.
So do I. You can't shake it completely, can you? Right? There's some remnants there in me too, right?
Yeah. Like when politicians talk about, price gouging laws or something, I lose a little chunk of my soul. But
Right.
yeah. So I guess I think this will be posted on my channel as well, right? So for people who don't know who you are, who are you?
Yeah, well, my name's Pat Flynn. I live in Waukesha, Wisconsin. For my philosophical work, I mostly do stuff related to metaphysics and philosophy of religion and philosophy of God. I have a book out that's almost about a year old called The Best Argument for God. And like you, oh, dude, thanks for the promotion. Super appreciate it. So my philosophical, how did my background begin? I have to rewind the tape a little bit longer than you. I was largely interested in two things from a young age philosophically. One is contingency and the other is skepticism. And these are sort of the two things that still haunt me to this very day. I think contingency and skepticism are just like, man, I think about them all the time, right? And then sort of by high school, I was acquainted with certain writers that were philosophically interesting. They weren't themselves philosophers. I'm talking like people like Mark Twain and H.L. Mencken. And Mencken was interesting. A lot of people have sort of forgotten about him, but he's sort of like a prototype of Christopher Hitchens, extremely polemical, kind of a very crusty old atheist. I loved him. He was hilarious. Also himself, something of a libertarian. So he had one of the first books out on Nietzsche in English. And I went after that, and that just sort of sucked me into philosophy proper, but, from an old atheist existentialist sort of standpoint. And for many years, I continued in that direction. And in terms of philosophy, I was also interested in political philosophy at the time. Libertarianism seemed to make a lot of sense to me. So I was reading all those thinkers. And it was funny, man, because it was kind of like going deeper into Rothbard and that direction, sort of towards the, anarcho-capitalist, that it just started to lose its grip on me, like slowly. And in the same way, that was what happened with naturalism. It wasn't even like I was totally like investigating alternative paradigms. It just seemed like there were certain things that just internally didn't work. This couldn't explain certain things that I felt really needed to be explained. So it was a sort of increasing dissatisfaction that eventually caused me to lose my grip on both of those. And after I sort of threw my hands up, I haven't come back to political philosophy. I just sort of given up on that, right? I just went in the direction of metaphysics. I figure, maybe when I'm like 50 or 60, I'll start to work out more stuff downstream. That's when I started to really consider like perennial philosophy, stuff like that. I was always kind of broadly familiar with, the old guys, Plato and Aristotle, from like my undergrad philosophy courses, but nothing super in depth. So I wanted to just give different schools of thought a chance. And over time, I just became increasingly convinced of, call it like a big tent Platonism. I thought like, wow, there's a really good system here. But as it happens within the system, there also tend to be some arguments, and I emphasize within the system, for the existence of God that I find pretty strong. So eventually that, made me into a theist. And I've just sort of been thinking about that and related issues ever since. So here we are. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I really agree with what you said about how it's sort of like, as you look into the naturalistic worldview, it sort of becomes less and less viable. It sort of seems like you have to, you give an analogy in your book of like a who denies Lincoln, and they sort of, in terms of all the evidence for Lincoln, all the historical events that Lincoln's existence explains, all the writings about him, they say, well, maybe there was a vast conspiracy to manufacture them, and maybe you can give an explanation for any particular thing, but as a whole, the worldview stops looking very plausible. I think that's really true, and in terms of theism versus atheism, where the atheist can come up with explanations of limited phenomena, right? So they can patch the problem with fine tuning by invoking a multiverse. Now, of course, there are things that make a multiverse pretty unlikely on atheism, so that's still evidence against atheism. They can patch their problems in terms of explaining consciousness by being a dualist of some sort and saying, we happen to get laws that make bits of matter give rise to consciousness. Just we got lucky, and they can patch the particular problems. But just as a whole, there are so many different problems that they need to patch that the worldview starts looking very implausible. An analogy I've given is it's a little bit like a young Earth creationist,
Right.
where if you're a young Earth creationist, any particular thing you can invoke some creative thing to explain it away, but just the as a whole, it starts there are so many different things that look very old that you have to invoke particular gerrymandered explanations of every particular one. There are things that evolution explains very well, and it's hard to explain all of them as a whole. And I think just the worldview as a whole, it just stops making very much sense. And I found that as I investigated more into philosophy, there just was over and over again some topic where I was like, where it seemed theism made a lot of sense of the topic. So, for example, philosophy of mind. You have the theism makes sense of why there's consciousness at all, why there's psychophysical harmony, which I think we'll talk more about later. When I investigated anthropic reasoning, theism made most sense about that. So it was just, there were a lot of different things where it seemed like the atheist was left scratching their head and having to invoke ad hoc explanations, where the theist had a really good and parsimonious explanation of them. And so it just made more sense of the world as a whole.
Yeah, I like your I like your comparison between naturalism and young Earth creationism. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be upset by that, but the relevance here is that,
and the young Earth creationist,
both of them, right? But I think it's a really good point, because I haven't listened to many young Earth creationists give their account, but I know when they try to deal with certain facts of the matter, they do have to put these sort of patches in, right? Like the laws of physics changed or altered or something at certain points, right? So it begins to create certain complexities that seem to significantly reduce the likelihood of that theory being true. And I agree with you. And I think I say this in my book. It's been a while since I looked at my book, but I think I was fairly modest in the sense that I can see that there are, naturalistic explanations on offer for various issues, right? But my contention was, where you can get that sort of explanation requires sort of independent, costly assumptions. These things aren't the sort of thing that just sort of flows either inevitably or naturally from the core commitments of the theory. right? So they're ad hoc, right? It's these patches that you're talking about, which to me personally, I wasn't ignorant of these things even back when I was a naturalist. I just found them totally unbelievable. And it's for me, and this was kind of the fit, I guess, that I had, the philosophical fit that I had, was that I felt like if I was going to stay a naturalist, I had to accept a lot of different forms of anti-realism, if that makes sense. But I wasn't willing to accept that, right? Like, just for whatever reason, I haven't been able to, go down that direction, whether it's with eliminativism over certain phenomena, or the nominalism, or what have you. It just seemed like, nah, these are sort of Morian facts for me. So if I can find some sort of theory that can, give a unifying explanation of all this, right? That would be super nice. And I think you're right, Matthew. I think theism, and we can get into the simplicity debate if we want, because that's complicated, but I think theism is the theory that explains the most with the least, right? It's got that sort of bang for buck virtue that somebody like Schaffer talks about, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. And so I sort of went a slightly different way when I was a naturalist, where, well, so I don't know if I would technically count as a naturalist, right? Because I didn't believe in God, but I believed in, I was a moral realist and a moral non-naturalist.
Yeah.
And, I thought mine didn't reduce, right? So I thought, these things are just, I'm really confident that it's wrong to torture babies, and that this fact doesn't depend on what we think about it. I'm really confident.
I was confident in that too. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm really confident.
It's a good thing to be confident in. Yeah. Right. Uh-huh.
Yeah. That, like, thoughts aren't made of particles. Yeah, but as I was thinking about it, it just seemed like my worldview internally, the bits didn't fit together, where there were all these cases where there would be some fact about the world, like that there are laws that give rise to consciousness, that we have somehow we come to have direct access to the moral facts, where it's like, well, if our beliefs come from our brain, the moral facts don't seem like the type of thing that can move around the atoms in our brain. So if our moral beliefs all just come down to the atoms in our brain, then it's very hard to see how we have reliable moral beliefs. It would be like if you imagine you can come to conclude that there's a table on the basis of seeing it, but that you're hallucinating the table. You know that you would see it even if there was no table. Well, then you have no justification for thinking that there's a table. And so if the reason why we have our moral beliefs has nothing to do with the fact that they're true, then it's a really big coincidence that we have the right moral beliefs. And so it just seemed like that we have reliable moral beliefs was very unexpected. That the way consciousness there was so much that was unexpected, that it seemed like the worldview, the bits didn't fit together well. That in order to accommodate the intuitive data of there's consciousness, consciousness is about what experiences are like rather than the ways that stuff functions, that we know certain things about morality and mathematics and modal facts and so on. In order to accommodate that data, you had to add in a lot to the worldview that didn't follow naturally from the worldview, and that ended up being very improbable.
So that's interesting. You say that. So you were an atheist. You didn't believe in God, but you wouldn't have classified yourself as a naturalist. Now, of course, this is one of the problems, is that there's different flavors of naturalism. It almost seems like, Ben and Jerry's to me, right? There's a whole lot of different flavors of naturalism, so when I think of it, I think of, sort of the more reductive kind, right? Called a conservative naturalism. And it seems in recent years, there's been this sort of proliferation of these more, call them exotic or liberal forms of naturalism. Honestly, those weren't on my radar as much when I was a naturalist. And if you would have sort of explained some of those to me when I was a naturalist, I would have been like, I don't know what you're talking about. Right. I just wouldn't have, and that's why naturalism is sort of a term of art. Right. So I think, like, what was one of the reasons I was a naturalist? Well, I guess it's the sort of non-crude version of scientism, right? Like, we can sort of science it all. We have a sort of superiority here, because through some combination of evolutionary and atomic theory, right, we can make sense of everything that needs to be made sense of. And there's something like really nice and elegant about that, right? At least as like an initial promise. The problem is, I think it doesn't work, right?
Yeah. I mean, aside from not accounting,
but like once you're out of that, right? And you're positing certain features of the world, like you just described, that clearly are not coming through that epistemology, well, then, like, man, it's just everything seems fair game at that point, especially considerations for the existence of God, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Right. There is this sort of attractive promise where it's like, we just believe in the stuff that the physical sciences tell us about. But then when you realize the stuff that the physical sciences tell us about involve vast coincidences in terms of fine tuning, doesn't account for consciousness, doesn't account for how we know things about morality, doesn't explain why anything exists at all, doesn't explain why there are laws or why the laws are applicable or why the laws produce any interesting structures or why consciousness is harmonious, then while it's a nice promise that you can get everything from the just believing the stuff science tells you about and taking that to be fundamental, it ends up being a very poor explanation of fundamental reality.
Yeah, I'm with you. So one thing I want to make sure we talk about, we can do this now or we can do it later, is your Matthew's best argument for God, right? Which actually is a single argument. I don't want to say I'm cheap with my book, but my book's sort of a cumulative case, right? But you have, I think the name of your article is called The Best Argument for God, and you actually do give one argument. Was this the argument that actually moved you towards theism, or had you already moved towards theism and then you began to think about this argument? And then maybe we can
so
get into details.
What moved me so the process of becoming a theist was, so for a while I'd thought, okay, yeah, there are some arguments that are decent for theism, but there are lots of times when there's a worldview that you sort of see that there's some stuff going for it, but it just seems so absurd to you. I think this is the way a lot of people approach eliminative materialism, for example, where they're like, okay, there's some stuff going for it. It reduces the mystery of consciousness, but it's just not a plausible view of reality. But so the first thing that sort of made theism seem like a live option to me, and I don't know why this is, but I was reading Andrew Hronich has a book where he argues for universalism, and he's a Christian and he argues for Christian universalism, and just something about reading that book, it just, for the first time, theism started seeming like a live option. Like, even though at that point I wasn't a theist, it started seeming like, okay, maybe if the Bayes, if we do the Bayes analysis and and theism comes out on top, okay, maybe it's a live option. It's not absurd. And then from that, I just sort of thought more about the arguments on both sides, and I concluded that the arguments for theism were just better. It wasn't a single argument that convinced me. It was considering a lot of different arguments, but this was one of I'd say the four that moved me the most were the argument from the fine-tuning argument, the argument from psychophysical harmony, this argument, the anthropic argument, which we'll talk about, and then some version of the argument from moral knowledge, where theism provides a better explanation of how we come to know about morality. So I guess I can explain what the anthropic argument is. But if we are going to count cumulative cases as arguments, then I think the best argument for God is clearly a cumulative case. It's not just a single consideration, but it's sort of a whole bunch of considerations. Though I think that's cheating. So I didn't have that. Be the best.
Well, I do. Yeah, I do have. So I consider one of the best arguments for atheism in my book is, hey, two theories explain just as much. Believe the simpler atheism, and theism explain just as much. Blah blah blah. Atheism is simpler. Believe that. So my argument is like, hold on, buddy. Naturalism can only explain some of what theism can, but only when strapped with much greater complexity. And then it just sort of lets me open up the cumulative case, right? Real quick, before we get into,
and we should also talk about your favorite argument for God, which is sort of, it's a cumulative case, but sort of like you focus a lot on these sort of contingency style considerations.
Yeah, those have always, because like I said, man, like when I was very young, contingency just sort of haunted me, and I think I'm sure it's the same with you, right? I'm sure you just had very obscure philosophical thoughts from a very young age, right? And then you just later learn like, oh, okay, I'm not the weirdest guy on earth. There's other people who are weird like me, and they just got the name philosopher. I guess I'll just become one of those, right? I remember like really young. So my earliest memory is just like looking outside of my grandparents' window, and just like wondering, why doesn't all this stuff just like go blank, right? Like I wasn't even concerned with how it got there. I was just like concerned with, it just doesn't seem necessary, right? I didn't have it well articulated in my head, but like, what's the guarantee that I'm not going to go to sleep tonight and there will just be nothing tomorrow, right? It'll actually give me quite a bit of anxiety as a kid, right? Same thing with like skeptical scenarios and stuff like that. So those are the two things that I always wrestled with the most, and that ultimately I think theism is the best sort of response to them, both philosophically and from like a personal existential standpoint. And I think if we're being honest, those things are always deeply intertwined in our lives, right? Let's talk about fine tuning first before we get to your argument, because we have a lot of crossover. I agree with you. I think the fine tuning argument is powerful. And it's one I almost was like considering leaving out of my book because it was not like a heavy area of specialization for me. But then I'm like, you know what? I really haven't settled my mind on this. Let me just go and like spend a good amount of time in the literature and then like see where I wind up. Right. And that's what I did. And after I did that, I really just came out and was like, yeah, this seems like a darn good argument for theism. I at least got to say something about it in my book. So I did. And I kind of went through some of the more forceful objections, but I'm curious your take on it. You think it's a good argument too. You brought up the multiverse. Sell me on it. I guess sell everybody else on it. What is it about the fine tuning that you really think gives it the force that it does for you?
So I think, let's start by explaining what the fine tuning argument is.
Yeah, that'd be a good first step.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the fine tuning argument, the idea is that we have a universe that has complex structures forming. And the idea is that this is very improbable, both in terms of physics and just as a point of that you don't need physics to know about, but that you can just sort of see intuitively. So first with the intuitive point, or actually first the physics point. It turns out that the laws of nature, the constants, which are the values that you plug into the laws of nature, they fall in an extremely narrow range, such that if you tweak them very slightly, no complex structures of any sort could arise. So for example, take the cosmological constant, which governs how quickly the universe expands. It falls in this very narrow slice, about 1 part in 10 to the power of 120 of the possible values it could take on. And it happens to be in this very, very, very narrow range, such that if it were any different value that wasn't in this narrow slice, that's 1 part in 10 to the power of 120 of its conceivable values, then no complex structures of any sort would form. If it were too weak, then the universe would collapse in on itself after like well below a millisecond. If it was a bit stronger, then everything would fly apart immediately and no two atoms would ever interact. So you have and there are lots of other things like this. So the idea is the constants, they fall in this narrow range. It's not just the constants, it's also the laws. So for example, suppose you just deleted any of the laws of physics. Suppose you deleted the law of gravity. No, you never get life. You never get any interesting or complex structures. Things would start going in one direction and keep going forever. And you never have any structures binding or forming together. And then there's also, in terms of the initial conditions, the universe had to start in a very specific state that's very improbable in order for it to produce any complex structures. So there's this point from physics that it's very narrowly balanced. And then there's also this more basic conceptual point, which is that getting complex structures it's hard to do. If you think about the simplest ways the laws could be, like here's the simplest way reality could be: nothing exists.
Nothing. Yeah, that's a great simple hypothesis, right? Yeah. I also think it has probability 0, right? So something's weird here.
Or if stuff does exist, here's the simplest way stuff could exist. You have physical stuff that exists, just sits around doing nothing forever. Very simple. Or if you are going to have it do something, it just moves in a circle, or it just moves in a line. All these are very simple. All the simplest ways for reality to be don't produce anything interesting. Famously, John Conway, who's a mathematician, there's a website you can go to called Conway's Game of Life, where you place down little dots and they will move around the screen and form cool patterns. Conway had to work really, really hard in order to find a way for them to do that. They follow 5 simple rules and they move around the screen and form cool patterns. Conway had to work really hard to find a way of getting a pattern of 5 rules to produce anything interesting, because the vast majority of ways that it could be simply don't produce anything interesting.
Right.
And so there's this conceptual point that you wouldn't expect anything interesting. And then we observe, look, the universe does have interesting stuff. It doesn't just have everything moving in a circle. It has trees and planets and life and conscious creatures. And so this is all very improbable. And then we ask, okay, what's the explanation of this very improbable phenomenon? Well, I think nearly everything that people say about the fine-tuning argument, you can see as wrong just as a matter of basic logic or by understanding what the argument says. So, for example, people often like to say, well, maybe life could rise under different conditions. Maybe if the laws were different, you could have different kinds of life. This just doesn't grapple with the point that the fine-tuning argument is making, where if the cosmological constant were different and everything flew off into space after less than a millisecond, or everything collapsed in on itself after less than a millisecond, no life could arise, right? It's not like, well, okay, maybe different chemistry could arise. No, nothing would ever interact with anything else.
That's
So
right.
yeah, so that's wrong as a matter of probability. Then people will say all these different things. They'll say like, well, how do we know what the odds of the laws are? We don't know. It could take on the other values, but you could say that about any, right? So, people will say, look, why do we assume that it could have been any of the other values? Well, okay, imagine that how do we know it's improbable? Well, imagine that the laws of physics started out spelling out made by God. Would that be good evidence for the existence of God? You could make the same argument. You could say, how do we know it could take on other values? But nonetheless, when we see a value when we see some phenomenon that could conceivably take on lots of different values, and it happens to take on one very, very specific value, if there's a theory that explains that, that's a big advantage of the theory. If we see a person get a bunch of royal flushes in a row, we don't just say, it's necessary. I'm a necessitarian, so there's no puzzle. We say, no, because they got 10 royal flushes in a row, probably they're cheating in poker. And so
yeah, that's a really good point. Let's pause there, because that's one of the objections to fine tuning, right? Is this, well, it's necessary, right?
Yeah.
I've got a number of issues with that, but I think that this is like, how to phrase it, right? Like the worst best objection, or the best worst objection, right? Like it can be, and is often presented as a very sophisticated objection, but to the extent that you just claim that something is necessary, that itself doesn't specify this particular arrangement, right? You need to create further patches and further complexity. So even with this sort of necessity objection in one's back pocket, I think you're still going to have to borrow very significantly from the priors, if you will, if you're going to have any sort of actual explanation of the data, that it's going to be a wash at the end of the day. And then I'll just go further and just say, like, just something being necessary isn't a great, like, ultimate stopping point for things always anyways. But give me your thoughts on that, on the
I completely agree. I think in order for some explanation to be a good explanation of something, it has to raise the probability of that particular thing turning out that way, right? So if you say, so it's not a good explanation. Suppose suppose I show you a deck of cards and it's in some random pattern. You say, I have a theory that there's a fairy, and the fairy arranged in that pattern. Well, positing the fairy isn't a good explanation, because the probability of getting that pattern conditional on there being a fairy is no higher than conditional on there not being a fairy. So that's a very bad explanation. Also, fairies don't exist. They're not part of our background information. But so what you want out of an explanation is something that raises the probability of that particular thing. Well, conditional on the universe being necessary, that doesn't raise the probability of getting this particular pattern. It just raises the probability of whatever the pattern is, that'll
be necessary. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Right. But we don't accept this in any other context, right? So we don't say a person wins the lottery 10 times. And you're like, okay, maybe I think you rigged the lottery. And they say, no, it's simply necessary that I went in the lottery 10 times. I'm a necessitarian. I think whatever happens is necessary. So it's necessary that I won the lottery. No, we say, okay, but it's so unlikely that would be necessary out of all the things that could be necessary. And so similarly, it's so unlikely that you'd get a 1 in 10 to the power of 120. It would fall in this range on the odds of 1 in 10 to the power of 120 if, just saying it's necessary isn't a good explanation. And then it's also obvious that the laws of nature are not in fact necessary. They could be otherwise. So I think a lot of the objections to fine-tuning are like this, where you hear them and they sound good, but you really think through them and you can just see that they're mistaken as a matter of basic logic.
Yeah. All right, let's cover the second one then, because I think there's there's normalization issues are interesting, but let's go to a multiverse, right? What's your take on that? Why don't you think that this can come to the aid ultimately of the naturalist?
So I think a multiverse, it's the best that a naturalist has got, right? If you're a naturalist, you should believe in the multiverse. And I think also, as we'll talk about later, if you're a theist, you should also believe in the multiverse.
Sure.
But so I think the multiverse, that's one that you really have to think through, because I don't think that it has any basic conceptual flaw. I mean, the broad point is that even if the naturalist can explain it by invoking a multiverse, the probability of a multiverse conditional on naturalism is not 1, right? Just naturalism doesn't naturally necessitate a multiverse. So it's still going to be some evidence for theism. The theist has a really good explanation of this. The naturalist has to invoke some extra thing. So it's similar to as we were talking about before, the young Earth creationists to invoke some extra hypothesis. Sure, they can patch up the problem, but it's not very probable. And then I also think that a multiverse, it has various different problems. So I'll list just 4 of them. The first one is that I think it just pushes fine tuning back a level. So the conceptual point is that, look, it's very rare that you'd get some physical system that produces interesting structures. You wouldn't expect, to have a universe that produces interesting stuff just by chance. A multiverse just is a physical system that produces interesting structures. It's the idea is that there's some physical system that generates a bunch of universes with different laws. Well, a universe, it's very unlikely that, if you wrote a computer program at random, you almost certainly wouldn't get it generating a bunch of different universes, right? The vast majority of ways that fundamental reality could be wouldn't produce that.
Yeah.
Second of all, you need a very specific multiverse, given that there's fine-tuning for both the constants, laws, and initial conditions. So you need to have the constants, laws, and initial conditions all vary between the universes, which, that's not what you'd expect conditional on a multiverse. So that's a further improbability. It has to scramble all 3 of them. Third, the philosopher Robin Collins has talked about fine-tuning for discoverability, where the idea is that in order to do proper science, various parameters have to be finely tuned. He says this is true of various parameters in particle physics. This is true of, I forget there's something that governs the strength of the weak nuclear force, I think it is. So, it has to be in this narrow range to do science. And so the multiverse doesn't explain why it's fine-tuned for science. Because the idea of the multiverse explanation is, okay, maybe the odds of us existing per universe are low, but we only find ourselves in the universes that we exist. But on conditional on the multiverse, if it doesn't explain fine-tuning for discoverability, why we can do science properly, then it's very unlikely, conditional on atheism plus a multiverse, that we'd find ourselves in a universe where we can do science. And then the last point is simply that even if we discover that there is a multiverse, I think that would be evidence for theism, right? Because God would want to make a bunch of universes. It's good, creating stuff's good. God's maximally good. So he'd make a bunch of universes. Right. So even the best case scenario for the atheist is to say, our explanation is this thing that we'd expect on theism and not expect on naturalism. So best case scenario, the atheist just gives you another, there's just another piece of evidence for theism. But I'd be curious to hear, what do you think of the multiverse explanation of fine-tuning?
That's it. That's exactly it. I think I had almost all of those considerations in my book, man. So I think we're kind of on the same page there. I agree with you that if there is a multiverse, then I think it's certainly that would itself be evidence for a theistic worldview. And, every sort of worldview has its certain governing principles, right? But the ones that I find attractive are, right, that goodness tends to self-disseminate, right? To diffuse, right? You were kind of saying it in different language, right? It's good to create things, right? So a good thing will create things. So traditionally, this is, related to the great chain of being and the principle of plenitude, right? That God would, if he's going to create at all, he's not going to create just one rock, right? He's going to create an incredible, enormous amount of things, the great chain of being. So I think that fits well with your point. I think multiverse also invites certain skeptical scenarios, which again are concerns to me. So I'm sure people have heard about the Boltzmann brain, type of issue, brief brain type of issue. I think those are real issues, right? And to overcome those, I think would require some further complications. That's the only other point I would make, is that how it just seems to invite these skeptical scenarios. And I'll tell you, man, one of my core commitments is avoiding skepticism, just straight up, right? It's just one of those things for me, where it just seems absolutely right that it's wrong to torture babies. It seems right to me that we are not in these sort of scenarios where knowledge is impossible, right? So if there's something that it seems to undermine that tends me towards a sort of global skepticism, yeah, I'm inclined to see if I can find some sort of alternative, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Alexander Proust, he has an argument for God from the avoidance of skeptical scenarios. He says, look, we know we're not in a skeptical scenario, right? That's just sort of a basic commitment to rationality and so on. But on atheism, there are lots of different ways reality could be where we'd end up in a skeptical scenario. On theism, those would be much less likely because, God doesn't want us to be massively deceived. And so the fact that those don't happen is evidence for theism. Which
finish your thought and I'll chime in, right? Mm-hmm.
That was the end of the thought. I was just going to say, I think that's right.
Yeah, so like there's something there's something about like Descartes' old approach that I kind of liked, right? I don't think it totally works, where he essentially makes a similar claim, right? That the reason we know we're not being deceived by a demon, right, is because God wouldn't, allow that to happen. I think it's just a little too strong. I mean, clearly God does allow us to be deceived, right? In certain instances. But I think local instances of deception are relevantly different than large scale, systematic type of issues. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think. Or sorry.
That's it. That's the thought. I know we keep thinking we're going to say more. That's it. Now that's all I got. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Right. So people certainly are deceived. I think what God wouldn't allow is people being deceived on a global scale. And
That's
I
what I'm
think,
saying. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and he might not allow, like, when people are deceived, they tend to be in a state of sort of muddled thinking, right? Like if you think about, times, you're sort of confused, you don't really know what's going on. It might be like, I think it seems plausible that God wouldn't allow people who are in states like ours, where we're, clearly and distinctly thinking, not muddled and confused. He wouldn't allow people like those to be deceived. Right. So maybe there would be a little, but if it would want us to avoid some global skeptical scenario, then I think theism gives a good way of doing that. I think it's worth explaining why a multiverse might imply the Boltzmann brain scenario. So the idea is there are kind of, as far as I understand, there are kind of two reasons why it might imply it. So a Boltzmann brain, the idea is just like a brain randomly fluctuates into existence in the recesses of outer space and then, dies after a few seconds. So the multiverse that's supposed to explain fine-tuning. One of the most extraordinary examples of fine-tuning is fine-tuning for the universe being in a low entropy state, where entropy is like the amount of chaos that's going on. And the universe started out really, really orderly. And so that's very improbable. But they say the share of the possible values it could take on that were in an energy state as low as ours was about 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123, right? So it's very improbable. Now, of course, maybe you think like a lower entropy state is simpler or something. So maybe it's probably not that low of odds, but still, nonetheless, a lot of universes will have high entropy states. But if there's just a lot of chaos going on, a bunch of brains will randomly fluctuate into existence, which means that the vast majority of people with my exact experiences or your exact experiences will be short-lived brains that randomly fluctuate into existence for 5 seconds in the recesses of outer space and begin dying, right? So if you notice you're not suffocating, your vision isn't blacking out, then you get good evidence that you're not a Boltzmann brain, and consequently, you get good evidence for the existence of God. The other reason why it makes Boltzmann brains is that the universes that so a lot of the universes that are not finely tuned just have random chaos, just have nothing interact, but a lot of them just have a lot of chaos. Chaos, it doesn't lead to stable complex structures like our universe, but it does lead to short-lived Boltzmann brains. So the number of the number of non-finely tuned universes vastly outnumbers the number of finely tuned universes. And then the number of finely tuned universes, the not finely tuned universes can still have Boltzmann brains. So the total number of Boltzmann brains, at least on a default multiverse model, would seem to outnumber the number of real brains. Now, of course, it's not the case that like every multiverse model will necessarily imply mostly Boltzmann brains, but it's just another hurdle that they have to overcome, that they have to say something about why you don't get mostly Boltzmann brains.
Yeah. Good statement, man. All right, let's move forward. We mentioned your anthropic argument. I want you to get this out because I read your article and I read a lot of stuff, arguments for God. Some of it's good, a lot of it's crap. And every once in a while something really captures my interest. And yours really captured my interest. So I want to have you present it. I want to have you talk through it a little bit. It was new for me. Is this, I guess I'll start there. Is this an argument of your own devising? Are you grabbing inspiration from somebody else with this argument?
Yeah, it's an argument of my own devising. I'm writing a paper with a friend of mine about it.
Yeah. Well, it's awesome, man. Let's get it out on the table.
Yeah, thanks. So the idea of the anthropic argument is, so it starts with a view. So anthropic reasoning it's the type of reasoning about how you reason about your own existence. So here's a very simple example of anthropic reasoning. Suppose a coin is flipped. If it comes, no coin's flipped. Scratch that. So God creates one person with a blue shirt and 9 people with a red shirt. You get created, you're in the dark. What odds do you give to having a red shirt? Seems like the answer is 90%, because 90% of the people who exist come to have a red shirt. Right. So that's a very simple anthropic puzzle. So now here's where things get a little trickier, right? So that just it's very simple to understand what kind of thing anthropic reasoning is. So a coin gets flipped. If it comes up heads, 1 person gets created. If it comes up tails, 10 people get created. You get created from this process. What odds do you give to the coin having come up tails? So there are two main kinds of answers. One answer is you say you're indifferent. You didn't learn anything new, so you remain at 50-50. This answer is wrong. It's wrong and bad, and we should all reject it for reasons I'll explain in a minute. The other answer you give is tails is 10 times likelier than heads, because 10 times as many people get created. So there's a view of anthropics according to which, upon existing, you get evidence that there are more people. And the intuitive idea behind this is that if more people exist, it's likelier that you'd be one of the people that comes to exist, right? Just like if you bake more pies, the odds that any particular pie would come to exist are higher. So I'll argue for the self-indication assumption in a moment. First, I'll just lay out the sketch of the argument. So, if we have the self-indication assumption, what we conclude is, from the fact that you exist, you get evidence that there are more people. So 10 times as many people makes your existence 10 times likelier. But here's where we go down the crazy train. Infinite people existing is infinitely likelier, because there are infinite times as many people. And it turns out some infinites are bigger than others. So really what this gives you evidence for is that every possible person exists. Or at least that the number of, maybe not literally every possible person, maybe, God sees some particularly wretched people and is like, okay, I'm not going to create those. But that whatever the biggest number, whatever the biggest cardinality of, whatever the number of possible people there is, God makes roughly that many people, right? It turns out that the number of possible people is a very large infinity. Some infinites are bigger than others. And so some infinities are larger than others. The number of possible people has a very plausible lower bound called Beth2, where Beth2 is it's a big infinity. It's more than the number of real numbers. So the real numbers are like not just 1, 2, 3, and 4, but also infinite non-repeating decimals. So it's more than that. So from the fact that you exist, I claim you get infinitely strong evidence that there are Beth2 people. And then we ask, what's the best explanation of that? Well, theism has a very nice explanation of that. God would want to create huge numbers of universes, massive infinity number of universes, because creating universe is a good thing. God would have no reason to stop at 5 or 10. He would want to make just as many he wanted to keep making these universes until he's made all the good ones. So theism has a very natural explanation of why there would be uncountably infinite people. In contrast, naturalism has no remotely plausible explanation of that. If you look at the number of naturalists who have proposed a worldview that entails the existence of Beth2 people, Beth2, remembers the number that is a lower bound on the number of possible people. I actually think it's more than that, but no need to complicate things. No
need to complicate an otherwise very simple argument, right?
Yeah. The number of naturalists who have proposed a worldview on which you get Beth2 people, it's literally like in the double digits, right? It's like David Lewis and Max Tegmark and like a few others who agree with them. And those worldview and all the atheist views that do this all have the problem of undermining induction, where all of them make it so that there are no more worlds where induction works and worlds where induction doesn't work. And so then your credence, there are an infinite number of copies of you that have your exact experiences where induction fails 1 second from now, where the sky collapses or everything turns into a squid, or fails in an infinite number of crazy ways, right? So I think if you're an atheist, the only way to get Beth2 people is to add something very, very implausible to your theory, which also has the defect of undermining induction. And so that's bad news for the atheist. So then the question is, why accept that more people existing is more likely? Maybe it sounded a little bit plausible when we were talking about 5 and 10 people, but once we start talking about infinite people, then it starts to look very implausible. I think there are a bunch of arguments for this. Right, so I'm in my article I give 4. Over the course of my blog, I've probably given 15-ish. I think the case is really, really overwhelming, and that like the alternatives you can show. I have a paper where I argue that the alternatives are committed to like really crazy stuff. I'll give either 1 or 2 depending on how quickly the first one goes.
Yeah, well, I'll be sure, we're scratching the surface here. I'll be sure, at least on my end, to link to the to relevant blog posts for people who want to dive deeper into it as well.
Yeah. So the idea is, so let's imagine that you deny that more people existing. The fact that you exist gives you evidence that there are more people, right? So let's imagine that one person comes to exist, then a coin is flipped, and if it comes up tails, 9 more people get created. Okay. So suppose you come to exist. You don't know your birth rank. You don't know if you're the first person or not.
Mm-hmm.
So if you reject the self-indication assumption, if you reject that your existence gives you evidence that there are more people, then you think, okay, both theories are equally likely, right? Both theories make it equally likely that I would come to exist because more people existing doesn't make my existence more likely. But here's how you should reason about it. If there's only one person in total, then I'm guaranteed to be that one person, right? If there's only one person and I exist, then of course with 100% probability, I'm the first person. In contrast, if the coin that's flipped, that the first person flips, comes up tails, I could be any of the 10 people, right? So as a result of that, I only have a 1 in 10 chance of being the first person. Now suppose you learn that you're the first person. Well, you started at 50-50, and you being the first person is 10 times as strongly predicted if the coin comes up tails. Sorry, if the coin comes up heads.
Yeah.
So what this means is that now you have 10-to-1 odds that a coin that hasn't been flipped yet will come up heads based on what will happen if it comes up tails. So you get this very weird result where you can predict chancy events in the future in advance just based on the fact that if they turn out a certain way, various people will be created. And there are even crazier results along these lines, right? So imagine Adam and Eve are in the garden. They don't know they're the first 2 people.
Sure.
And they're like, okay, what are the odds that there will be a bunch of people? They reason, look, they don't know they're the first 2 people, so they're indifferent between the hypothesis that they're a lot and a little. But they reason, look, if there are a bunch of people, it's super unlikely we're the first 2 people. What are the odds of that? 1 in billions, if there are billions of people. Then they learn that they're the first 2 people. Now they get many billion to 1 update in favor of that they won't have any offspring. So now what Adam and Eve can do, and this is a well-known result in the literature for alternatives to self-indication assumption. What Adam and Eve can do is they can say, okay, we're going to reliably procreate unless a deer drops dead at our feet. And now they're really confident that a deer will drop dead at their feet.
Yeah, right. Uh-huh.
Because unless the deer drops dead at their feet, they will. Then they'll have many offspring. But they know, and they're almost certain that they won't have offspring, because if they had offspring, it's unlikely that they'd be so early. So the idea is that the self-indication assumption, if you deny it, you get these very bizarre results, about as bizarre as any result in all of philosophy, where you get the possibility of strange psychic powers just from probabilistic reasoning. You get what people find suspicious about the ontological argument, where it's like, how do you get just from a philosophical argument, how do you pull an infinite God out of just a mere philosophical argument? Like, just by thinking about it, you get God. You get stuff way weirder than that. You get psychic powers just from your philosophical argument. You get the safest form of birth control imaginable, because that and then it's very unlikely that you'll have lots of offspring. So, and note, this just applies to any alternative that and I have a paper that I had published that argues this, where this applies to any alternative to the self-indication assumption, because just the straightforward probabilistic reasoning is, if you don't think your existence is likely, or if there are more people, then if you don't know when you were born, what your birth rank is, you don't know if you were the first person, and then you will learn you're early, then you get really strong evidence that there won't be many people. And so then you can predict that, like, if a coin's going to be flipped, and only if it comes up tails will there be a bunch of people. You get incredibly strong evidence that it'll come up tails. If you can predict that you'll get royal flushes in advance, just from the fact that if you don't, you'll get a bunch of coin flips. This is one of the arguments, and there are like 15 of these, right? So I think the case for the self-indication assumption, while the self-indication assumption is pretty controversial, I think it's just obviously correct, and the alternative, right? So,
I want to pause there, because that's a very powerful consideration, and I don't know. I mean, like, look, there's, I guess, pretty much every position I hold is controversial, right? I mean, that's kind of like one of those, like, what isn't controversial? in philosophy, right? I mean, I hold to a form of the principle of sufficient reason. That's super controversial, but I also think that it's just obviously correct, right? And this relates to skeptical scenarios and I think other considerations again. So I guess something being controversial doesn't bother me too much. At the end of the day, it just comes down to what are the arguments for and against it. So that's a powerful consideration. I don't think we should be able to bestow psychic powers upon ourselves from just a couple philosophical claims, right?
And by the way, this like it doesn't just imply in sort of weird, far-fetched hypothetical cases that you could bestow hypothetical power, like psychic powers. It implies that, like, in the actual world, you could do this, right? So imagine, you don't know your birth rank, right? Or imagine you have a person and you don't tell them their birth rank, so they don't know that they're roughly the 110th billion person to ever live. And then they discover. So then you ask them, okay, so then you tell them, oh, you're the 110th billion people. Well, the probability that they'd be the 110th billion person, or roughly the 110th billion person in the first, say, 120 billion people, is much higher if there aren't people. So now if they say this, they're really confident that the world will end soon, because the world ending soon makes it much more probable that they'd be born so early by this probabilistic reasoning. So the world ending soon is, so as a result, like, if suppose a nuclear war, whether it would start, would be determined by a coin flip, they'd be really confident that the coin would come up heads, because otherwise there would be a bunch of people. Sorry, I realized there was a thing I forgot to explain about this. Just let me explain how the self-indication assumption avoids this kind of reasoning. So the idea is that, so in the coin flip case, where tails means 10 people get created, heads means 1 person gets created. It's really sort of elegant and neat the way the self-indication assumption avoids these results, where the idea is, okay, so you come to exist. On the self-indication assumption, you conclude tails is 10 times likelier than heads, because there are 10 times as many people. Then you learn that you're the first person. The probability that you'd be the first person conditional on the coin coming up tails is 1 in 10, while it's 100% conditional on the coin coming up 1. And so now you're back to 50%, right? So it very elegantly, it agrees, right? The point about how you get evidence that you're early from the fact that there aren't many people from the fact that you're early, this is just a trivial probabilistic point. But the idea is that the self-indication assumption exactly cancels it out, so you don't get utterly absurd results where you can get psychic powers in advance. Yeah,
that's a neat result, a good one.
Yeah, and now one common response that a person might have to an argument like this is they'll say, okay, maybe this all makes sense. I buy this with 10 people and 15 people, but it doesn't work with infinite numbers of people, right? And it certainly doesn't work with, like, bigger and smaller infinites, right? Maybe you can get evidence that there are, like, 1 million people is 1 million times likelier than 1 person, but you can't get evidence that there are, like, Beth 2 people is infinitely likelier than Beth 1 people. Remember, Beth 2 is a bigger infinity than Beth 1.
Right.
But once again, the same argument, and this is true of a lot of the arguments for SIA, they just work just as well when applied to infinity. That you can, the same thing will apply to the infinite case. So in this case, let's imagine. So imagine you say, look, it gives evidence there are infinite people, but it doesn't tell you that there's a bigger infinite. So imagine God creates Aleph null people, that's the smallest infinity, and then he flips a coin, and if it comes up tails, then he creates Beth 2 more people. Okay, so suppose you come to exist. You say bigger infinites existing isn't likelier than smaller infinites existing, so you're 50-50 between the two hypotheses, right? Then you find out you're one of the first Aleph null people. Well, because Beth 2 is infinitely more than Aleph null, the odds that you'd be one of the first people, first Aleph null people, if there are Beth 2 people in total, is 0. Right? So as a result of this, you're now infinitely certain that a coin that hasn't been flipped yet will come up heads, because if it comes up tails, a bunch of people will get created. Or similarly, if there will be 1,000 games of poker, and only if a royal flush comes up, you get a royal flush. In all of them, and Beth 2 people not be created, you get infinitely certain that Beth 2 people will be created. So the same type of psychic powers, like, it seems weird to apply the same reasoning to infinites, thinking that you get evidence there's, like, huge infinites worth of people, but if you don't, then you get the same weird results where you get strange psychic powers. And this is true of a lot of the other arguments for SIA, where they work just as well when applied to infinites.
Yeah, good, really good. Nice presentation too. So, all right, the other thing, I guess, you can tell me if there's other objections people have had. Like I said, I really just started thinking about this when I read your article. Actual infinities. You think that there can be an actual infinite, and for a while, I wasn't sure, and now I think yes. Has this been something that you had to work through with this argument? Have people pushed in that direction?
Yeah.
Give us
So
your thoughts there. Right.
yeah, so,
Mhm.
so that's one objection that people have raised. Now, I think a few points about this objection. First of all, I think the argument gives you a reason to think that there are actually infinite people, where the idea is
Sure.
just that
Yeah, it's an argument for it. Yeah. Right. Mhm.
right. It's that if there weren't absolute infinite people, then the odds that you'd like suppose there were only like a few billion people. Well, it would be 0% probability that out of the infinite possible people, you'd be one of the ones that happen to exist. So I think the argument, it gives you a reason to think there are absolute infinite people. It doesn't just like
Mhm.
assert it, right? So it doesn't require a controversial philosophical commitment. It gives you a reason to accept that controversial
Mhm.
philosophical commitment. And then the other point is that I just think we have independent reason to accept that there can be an actual infinite. How many things does God know? How many numbers are there? Seems like our best scientific evidence is pointing us to space being infinite and to space being indivisible, so being able to be cut up an infinite number of times. It's impossible if you can't have an absolute infinite, because then you couldn't have space be infinitely divisible. I think there are a lot of different things that seem to be infinite, such that the person who denies the absolute infinite is just committed to saying implausible things about lots of different areas, to denying that space is infinite and so on. Denying that time is infinite, they have to be an A theorist, because if they're a B theorist, then if they think the future is infinite, then there's an absolute infinite. So they just have to have like lots of different philosophical views that I don't find very plausible across a whole wide variety of domains.
Yeah, at least probably not together, right? There's a few of those that I might find plausible independently. And by the way, I'm with you on this. Like I said before, I was just sort of agnostic, but as I've come to think through this issue a bit more, and now with your argument as an additional consideration, right? Yeah,
Yeah, I was for a while
I'm
sympathetic.
going with you in that direction, right? Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. A while last summer, I was pretty sympathetic to finitism, to think you can't have infinites, because when it comes,
And
there
real
are
quick,
lots.
people, there's different finitisms, right? So like you could be a causal finitist, but still hold that there could be actual infinities, right?
Yeah,
Those things are compatible. So we're just really focused on the latter
yeah.
claim.
I think I lean towards causal finitism at this point, but
So do I.
um,
Yeah. Mhm.
yeah. Right, and actually, one nice thing about causal finitism. Well, I don't like the Kalam very much, but if you do like the Kalam, you don't need to be a finitist. You can just be a causal finitist, right? Because
That's
the
right.
idea is
Mhm.
you only need to rule out infinite causal chains, not all infinites.
Yeah, for a
Um,
causal finitist, you just don't think that an infinite number, that there can't be an right, that every sort of causal effect series comes to a particular single cause, right? But that's compatible with there still being actual infinities. Yeah. Mhm.
yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of objections that people
Sorry, I
raise.
can say that better. No one effect can be preceded by an infinite number of causes. There we go. That's how somebody like Proust would state it. Sorry. I'm off coffee right now, so if I'm lagging a little bit, that's why.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I also just had coffee recently.
Yeah, so we're just like,
Yeah,
hi, hello, hello, yeah, yeah. No, I'm just getting over. I keep telling on a podcast, people are always sick of hearing. I'm just getting over strep throat, which itself has been crushing to like my energy and focus.
oh
And now
no,
I'm
I'm
just
sorry
I'm
to
just
hear
like
that.
trying to like repair my diet, and so like coffee's out. So I've just just super low for a bunch of reasons, which is great when you're trying to think through difficult philosophical topics. But I appreciate the energy that you're bringing to compensate for my lack thereof. This is good. So yeah, so if people do like the Kalam, I guess you would have to give up some of the motivations for it, because there are philosophers who bark against actual infinities to run it, but there's also quite a number of other philosophers that see that you just need, right, the commitment to causal finitism, not just finitism in general, right, to run
Yeah,
that argument. Yeah, that's good. Okay, I mean, so I'm sorry I spent a lot of time on this, but I'm just super fascinated by this by this
No,
argument because
I'm very happy to answer, to say lots of things about it.
Yeah, just because it's so really new and fascinating. And I'm not the kind of guy, right? Just like any old argument for God is a good one, right? There's lots of arguments I object. This one is one that I've really been thinking about since I read it. I'm like, wow, there's something really kind of cool here. So why don't you just give us, like, is there one more objection that you think is interesting, worth considering, that you'd like to just discuss and give a response to? Otherwise, we
Yeah.
can.
So I'll say, I think people, often misidentify where the argument's controversial. I think the bit of it that's controversial really is the self-indication assumption. I think once you accept the self-indication assumption, that your existence gives you evidence that there are more people, then we're off to the races. Because if your existence gives you evidence there are more people, you get evidence that you get infinitely strong evidence that the number of people that exist is the maximum, the most there could be. And then if that's true, naturalism has no plausible explanation of how you get some massive infinity. So let me just address I'll address two sort of misconceptions about the argument that I think of where people get things wrong. Mm-hmm. One of them is people will often say, okay, sure, maybe the odds that I would come to exist are higher if there are more people. But in any case, someone would come to exist. And so in both cases, whether or not you have a bunch of people, like your argument across most worlds misleads people, right? Because if there are a billion people, then these billion people will be misled by the argument. Okay, but here's the thing: when evaluating some evidence, you want to look at the most specific version of the evidence. And the most specific version of the evidence isn't just at least one person wakes up; it's I wake up, I exist, and that's likelier if there are more people, as per the self-indication assumption. And so here's a way of thinking about it. Suppose that everyone in the world is put to sleep and a coin is flipped. If it comes up heads, 5 people get woken up. If it comes up tails, everyone gets woken up. Mm-hmm. Suppose I get woken up. I think I get really strong evidence that the coin came up tails because that makes it likelier that I would wake up. But a person could reason in the same way. They could say, look, both theories make it so that someone would wake up. And so then the question is simply, and so you're predictably misleading people. But even though they both predict someone would wake up, this one makes it likelier that I in particular would wake up. And similarly, a theory on which there are more people makes it likelier that I in particular would get created. Another misconception that people have about now I'm forgetting what the other misconception was.
That's right. Yeah, there are always a lot you got to hold in your head right at any one time when you're thinking through a bunch of philosophical issues. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think one very common argument that people will give is they'll say, they'll just give a whole bunch of reasons why maybe God wouldn't create a bunch of stuff. So they'll say maybe God wouldn't want to create it all because, he has already perfect subsistent goodness, and so he would have no reason to create. There's no imperfection in him, so he'd have no reason to create, etc. Or they'll say, well, and he'd create really awesome beings rather than sort of like humans who are limited and so on. I think this is wrong for 2 reasons. The first one is I just think they're all false, right? I think God would have a reason to create. It's good to create. If you're perfect, the same reasons why it's good to have a child are reasons why it's good to create beings and give them infinitely good lives. As we think God will do. And then, I think they're just wrong. Second of all, actually, there are three problems with it. I think they're just clearly changing the subject. Where, like, imagine I give the problem of evil, and your response is to just be like, well, don't you know that evil is contingent? And so that, in order to have evil at all, you need contingency. Okay, right, maybe that's true, but it's sort of a different argument. Okay, maybe God wouldn't create, but that's just a different argument, right? That doesn't address that doesn't address how much this argument should shift you. It's just a separate argument for why God doesn't exist. Because if God wouldn't create at all, then of course God doesn't exist, right? Because we know stuff got created. And then the final point is that even if you think it's very unlikely that God would create, right? Maybe you think there's only a 5% chance that God would create creatures like us. It's so much higher than the odds of you getting this many beings on naturalism, right? Yeah. Because the odds on naturalism are just infinitesimal. It's so unlikely that you'd get a world that's both conducive to induction and would have a lot of people. I don't know any naturalistic model that's ever been proposed that meets those 2 criteria. And even if you can come up with some gerrymandered naturalistic model, it's so improbable. So even if you think the odds are low, you have to look at the comparative odds. I think the comparative probability is very low. Yeah, I mean, people say, oh, I guess I'll address one more thing, which is people will often say that they'll say there's something sort of illicit about it, that it's a God of the gaps argument. It's saying, we don't know how you get so many people, therefore God must do it. But of course, this is very silly. if we applied this consistently, we would ignore all sorts of abductive reasoning, right? So imagine we discover stars spell out made by God. We say, it's a God of the gaps fallacy to think that's any evidence for God because we don't know what did it. Or we discover like that there's all this writing about Julius Caesar and these places that seem to have been conquered by him in gold coins. We say, well, it would be a fallacy to conclude that he's the explanation of why all these things happen. It's not a fallacy to say there are things we don't know about. Here's the best explanation of them, right? That's just all abductive reasoning. Anytime you do any probabilistic reasoning, that's what you're doing. So I don't think that it's that. There was one other point I went. Well, I don't know. Read the article. Hopefully,
there's a ton in there. Yeah, we can't. Nobody expects to give every little detail in a podcast conversation. I'm just hoping to get people interested in it. I was curious for my own sake. And right, I just want to go back to the idea that God would create. I mean, it's a very traditional understanding of God. Granted, there's these other metaphysical principles at play, but every system has its principles, right? These various principles of axiology and what have you, right? That, okay, well, if God were to make beings, he would make beings more awesome than us. Well, traditionally he did, right? They're up there. They're there, right? But also just us at any snapshot in time doesn't, quite capture how awesome we are to become as well, right? So this whole idea of a hierarchy or gradation of beings, where there are beings that are lower than us, there are beings that are higher than us, and there are beings that start at a particular state and journey on to greater states, right? That's what I think theism anticipates. I think that's exactly what theism predicts, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that this observation that we're not as great as we could be, I mean, this basically just is the problem of evil. It's like, why does so much about the world suck, right? Well, theists have had, many things to say about that. Whatever, if you whatever your theodicy is, like, if you believe, for example, that, in the primordial fall, right? So you think demons like screwed things up and that they're why the world is deficient in various ways. Okay, that explains why we have limited powers, both in terms of our empathy, in terms of our cognitive powers, and so on. Just whatever the theist will say about why there's evil, this will also explain why things aren't better, right?
Yeah. Well, why don't we talk about that right now, right? Because you said at the beginning, that you thought that the problem of evil was, the reason to remain an atheist. And I would have thought that and, science rocks were like the two biggest reasons, for me at the time. Science rocks, but the world sucks, right? That's why I'm an atheist. These are cartoon presentations, friends. I understand they have more sophisticated ways of being articulated, right? But that's it in a nutshell. And then as I've come to like think about the problem of evil more, man, and of course, I make one of what I think is a statement in my book that I think is not just possible, but probably true. I really think that there's almost, I'm trying to keep it somewhat modest, an abundance of riches here, right? And it's just mostly a matter of seeing how the accounts supplement each other in important ways to the extent that they're not, logically exclusive. And, for a while, because, even before I kind of held the commitments that I do now, I thought that there were some really interesting ways of maybe thinking about the problem of evil with certain notions like reincarnation in hand and pre-existence before entering a material form and stuff like that. I actually have some stuff written on that, but I never sent it out anywhere. I should dig it up and see if I still think that it's decent. Probably not. I don't think anything I wrote 5 minutes ago is decent, right? Let alone like however many years ago. But yeah, you're right. Right. So like when you kind of weigh it all up, to me, it's like, okay, all right, now we have the dimensions of suffering, right? The distribution and the dimensions of suffering, right? What can explain this? I want to talk about yours because you have this interesting, very interesting idea of conjoining the hypothesis of a difference to theism. But you mentioned a very traditional line of thought that, like, if somebody would have presented this to me initially, I would have thought it was crazy. But the more I've thought about the sort of implications of theism, the various principles at play, like the principles of plenitude and God working with things according to their nature and how God delegates roles, the sort of fallen archon theory seems to actually give a decent account, at least of some aspects of the problem of evil. And then you say all the other things in there that you might want to say. You can say some of what Van Inwagen says, right? I know you're somewhat attracted to his theory, as we mentioned in correspondence to one another, right? He gives his defense where, hey, something went wrong, and God kind of holding off on like intervening might be the best or only available means to like get things right, right? And then you have Stump's theodicy, which is more of a meticulous providence. You've got Sijuati's new theodicy of exemplarism and moral exemplars and non-moral exemplars and theories of compensation. And there's actually like a lot out there, right? Like a lot of it seems to like be really powerful, at least over a certain range. But there's definitely, I think, more room to harmonize a number of these accounts. I tried to harmonize some of the best ones that I thought could be harmonized in my book. Whether you have soul saving, soul building, I think those are certainly compatible as well. The importance of building relationships and community even prior to having a relationship with God, I think is a really interesting consideration. I know that you picked that one up as well. So sorry, I'm kind of throwing a lot of stuff at the board right now, but I'm sort of mapping the general scene. And of course, there's always just like I don't like no norms theism, but some people kind of take that approach as well. I don't think that's correct, but I also have a very hard time of like, I don't know how to show that it's wrong. You know what I mean? Right. Like I don't like Brian Davis could be a guy like this, and I do not follow him, but I also have a hard time like refuting his case as well. And I just don't think it's necessary. So that's enough of spitballing. Why don't I toss it over to you, and you can kind of give maybe some of your updated thoughts.
I think the problem of evil, it's a pretty strong consideration in favor of atheism. I still think that. I'd say the problem, I think there are there are quite a few good arguments for the existence of God. Fine-tuning, psychophysical harmony, moral knowledge, the anthropic argument, of course, number one. And I think the problem of evil, maybe it has about as much force as those other arguments. But, if we say problem of evil and fine-tuning cancel out, then we just have a wall of other evidence for theism. And, I don't think we have very much else going in favor of atheism other than the problem of evil. But in terms
I see you just pushed out, I think you just pushed out a Substack called like, what does the atheist have left or something? That I see that pop up right before. Yeah. So yeah, go ahead. Continue. Right.
Yeah. So I think, but one thing that I think makes evil a big challenge, I think there are kind of two things that make it a challenge that a lot of theodicies struggle with. One of them is that suppose you think there's really a good reason for all these evils, that actually, the world's a better place because of, malaria, because it builds our souls and so on. This has very troubling normative implications, where it implies seemingly that we shouldn't try to get rid of malaria because it makes the world a better place. Normally, you shouldn't try to get rid of things that are good. And second is that, so I don't think naturalism explains very well many features of the universe, like why there's one at all, why there are laws, and so on. But after you have all those things in place, naturalism makes a good explanation of the other stuff, where it's not like the evils that we're exposed to are the results of these fairly broad and general processes that you can see how they follow from the natural laws, like evolution, or like, the movement of the tectonic plates, right? It's not like they're narrowly tailored evils. Like God gives us narrowly tailored challenges for each of our lives, and that it's these broad general features of the world. And so I think that the hypothesis of indifference, well, it's a bad explanation of why there's a universe at all. It's a bad explanation of lots of stuff. After you have all that stuff in place, then it explains the evils very well. While it would be a very vast coincidence if the evils that were ideal for, say, soul building also happen to be the ones that were produced by the evolutionary process. So I think those are the challenges that a theodicy will have to meet. Fortunately, I think we have the tools to meet it. And I think once we add the following auxiliary hypothesis to theism, I think we explain the world so much better than naturalism. So the auxiliary hypothesis is that.
Yeah. So real quick, so what you're just like zoom out for people before you get in details. What you're doing is you're really just saying, hey, we can patch theism. We can add a complication, right, with this hypothesis of indifference. And once we do that, then the naturalist has nothing left, and this complication isn't going to inherently disqualify theism. So let's rock and roll. Yeah, continue. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the idea is that God wants to place us in a world naturalists explain why there's bad stuff by invoking the hypothesis of indifference. They say, look, there are these broad natural laws that produce stuff and don't care about our interests. The idea of the theist is, look, we have an infinitely long existence, we have an infinitely long afterlife, and so on. God wants us to spend some time in a universe that looks roughly like an indifferent universe, where God isn't providentially ordering all things, where God isn't like, controlling the movement of every atom so that it's maximally for our flourishing, but where it's better for God to have a policy of effectively placing us in a universe. And this is a picture that's fairly similar to the picture that you get biblically in early Genesis, where, in the early days, God is sort of dealing with humans much more directly. And then, it says in Genesis 3 something, God will not, he says, my spirit will not dwell with man forever, or something like that, where the idea is that there's sort of a barrier of separation between him and us, that this world is what happens when we're running the show, essentially, where God isn't ordering things too much. And so once you have that idea in place, that God would want to put us in broadly in an indifferent universe, a universe that functions according to natural laws and where he's not constantly intervening, maybe intervenes upon rare occasions, or maybe it doesn't, but where it's essentially being ordered, God isn't sort of rigging things to make sure every particular thing happens, then you explain it just as well as naturalism, because then the predictions of theism are basically, it makes the same predictions as naturalism, plus it predicts, more agents as per the anthropic stuff, and it predicts that you would have, it predicts a view of reality that's like naturalism, except naturalism plus things being rigged so you get agents at all. Well, it turns out, pretty much all the arguments for theism are preconditions of things of how you get agents that can interact in the world and figure it out, that the world is rigged for that. That explains why there's a physical universe at all, why there are laws, why the laws apply to the stuff that exists, why there's it explains all this stuff, right? So then after you supplant the hypothesis of indifferentism, where you say God wants to place us broadly in an indifferent universe, then you explain everything just so well and better than naturalism, and you explain dozens of things better than naturalism. And I think that this isn't we can give numerous motivations for why God might place us in such a universe. So one of them is, look, just like there's if you spend some time apart from a loved one, maybe, you spend some time apart from your wife going on vacation, you might appreciate them more, right? Spending some time apart from God, that might strengthen our eventual relationship with God. And given that a relationship with God is of infinite value, it infinitely compensates for all the suffering we endure on earth. Having God not be intervening too much and having the world be basically us running the show, that can help strengthen our relationships with other people. It might be better for, because we're really directly involved with tending to the welfare of other people without God sort of making sure nothing goes too wrong. It's better for soul building, just like you might grow more from experiences where it's not guaranteed that everything's like, you'll grow more from hardship if you can really mess up and suffer and not and have things genuinely go wrong, right? So it might be good for soul building. There might be all sorts of unknown reasons, right? It might have to do something with a demonic fall theodicy, where demons were given up free will and they created they created a universe like this, or messed up the universe so that it followed this law. You can just give most of the things that people say in theodicy, you can give a plausible explanation for why that would justify God having us spend 0% of our infinite existence in a universe that looks basically like a naturalistic universe. And then, so it's not that intrinsically improbable. And then it explains everything super well. It explains like all the things naturalism explains, plus all the things naturalism doesn't explain that theism explains. So I just think it ends up being way more plausible than naturalism. And even if you say, given that there are a lot of different things that naturalism poorly explains, I've listed a bunch. I've listed more things that naturalism poorly explains elsewhere. Even if you put only a little bit of weight on each of these things and say that the probability of God doing this is very low, naturalism still comes out way behind theism because it's so much more plausible.
Yeah,
or it explains so much more. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, we could do a whole conversation, and obviously the problem of evil, it's a huge topic, but I just wanted you to get the sketch of that out there, because one thing I appreciate about your blog is there's some real novelty there that's exciting to me. It's really interesting. It's got me thinking again. After reading your account, I've been thinking about, okay, well, how could this fit with other things that I think might be the case, right? And I think that there's various points of harmony there. You already indicated a few of them, right? With the demonic fall theodicies and stuff like that. So I guess it's kind of close to Van Inwagen's, but a little bit,
Yeah, I think it's a bit more general than Van Inwagen's, where Van Inwagen says, "Look, because we messed up, we spend time apart from God." And the idea,
right?
here
It's yeah, right. It's like
maybe
God
that's one of
had
the reasons
us.
why we spend time apart from
Yeah.
God. Maybe it's for a different reason. Maybe it's to strengthen our relationship with God. But it's it's not as much one specific theodicy as a broad kind of like rubric for theodicies, where it's like the basic thing is that we spend time in a world that is in some way, in some important way, separated from God, where God isn't constantly intervening, where God doesn't, tweak the laws to maximize value and so on.
Right. Yeah. Because I think in one of your posts you said that maybe it's more likely that God would create us in paradise, but on some accounts like Van Inwagen's, the answer is, well, initially that's kind of the case, right? And then you sort of let indifference take over after something happened, right? So there might be some harmony there between these accounts too, whether that how much further complication that will, gather up and how much that will cost you is another consideration. But that's right. And Van Inwagen's, I always like to draw a distinction. And maybe this is an illegitimate distinction. I think it is a legit distinction between, soul saving and soul building, right? Van Inwagen seems to be a soul saving, right? Or at least it starts soul saving and then it becomes soul building, right? And then there's some other theodicies that are just purely soul building. And that's an interesting distinction because I think it can do some important moral work, right? Right. Generally, we don't think that it's okay to like risk harming someone just to get them something they might want or might be good. But we do think it's generally okay to risk harming someone if it's the best or only available means to prevent something worse, right?
Yeah. I also think, and I just want to echo, I appreciate the nice things you said about my blog. And I found that to be true of your book as well. There were a lot of these very clever, ingenious arguments and a lot of, new and interesting and original things. I think that, so I think in terms of the point about whether you can harm people for a great good, I think it depends on the degree of the great good, right? So we normally think, suppose that a person doesn't want to, get medicine or something, and the medicine will save their life, right? So it'll give them this great good of continuing to live on. We normally think, okay, if the person is sort of not wanting to do it for irrational reasons, there might be prudential reasons not to do it, but it wouldn't be immoral to do it. Like maybe the person's addled or something.
Sure.
So I think if the benefit, if it's for an infinite benefit, as is generally the case for the great goods, given that they last forever, then finite suffering in this lifetime seems permitted in order to cause it, particularly even if they don't agree to it now, they'll later agree to it, right? They'll later be glad that you did it. And that with certainty. Then it seems like what matters more than actual consent to things like this is ideal consent, what a person will consent to later after their rational faculties are perfected.
Right.
And so
and almost all theodicists, I think, do or should say that. Pretty sure Stump says that, right? The idea is that looking back, you'll say thank you, right?
Yeah. The other thing is, if you buy a sort of pre-existence theodicy, maybe we did consent in the past life.
And that's one of the well, let's give a sketch here, right? Is that you pre-exist material incarnation, say, and everything's great, right? But then you have the chance to go build worlds. And maybe these worlds are generated at random and they're indifferent, right? But you consent to kind of enter into this adventure and to help create good worlds and whatever. Use your imagination, right? I'm trying to think if there's anybody out there who's, actively promoting an account like that. The last that I saw I think Josh Rasmussen has some sort of account of like, a consent-based or pre-existing contract-based type of theodicy somewhere in his work, but I don't want to lean too heavily in that because I could be misremembering.
My friend Amos has some articles on that.
Well, then we'll give a shout out to Amos, right? So there's a sort of another way to think about it, right? Difficult subject, man. A lot to think about. We're gonna have to do a two-parter, man, because I got to scoot here in a few, but I wanted to just like hit a few more things with you.
Yeah.
What are you thinking about now? What's sort of got you, at least on like the philosophy of God side or philosophy of religion side? What's currently got your interest?
I mean, I'm thinking more through the problem of evil. I'm thinking more about anthropics, I'm writing various papers giving more arguments for the self-indication assumption.
Yeah. It's funny
'Cause
because you said like, hey, once I had that assumption, I think it kind of goes through. I think there's a true of a number of arguments. I mean, like there's other steps to contingency type arguments and formulations, but I think once you have something like PSR, which is the real controversial thing, right? You can run a number of them, right? So that's not to say they're easy. It just means there's a lot of work you got to put in that kind of that initial step, right?
Yeah. I really do think that basically the self-indication assumption is the only philosophically controversial bit of the argument. There are other steps. There are other sort of steps you have to go through mechanically that are sort of tricky and annoying. But just in terms of like what might a person reasonably disagree with to reject the argument, basically the self-indication assumption, that's it. Which is good news because self-indication assumption happens to be obviously true and supported by a dozen very powerful arguments. Yeah, in part 2, we'll definitely have to talk more about your arguments for God, about the sort of contingency style arguments. Actually, I mean, in the last few minutes, do you think would there be time to give sort of a brief sketch for like?
Yeah. Well, let me just kind of give an overview of like because it's a family of arguments, right? And there's different iterations. I think I shared a blog of yours I thought was thoughtful where you were kind of giving a showcase of one of Rob Kuhn's types of like first cause contingency arguments, right? And there's some of these arguments I think are fairly independent, right? They're kind of standalone. You could kind of think of like what Alex Proust is up to. And the idea is something like this, right? That you have some sort of engine that runs the argument, right? A causal or explanatory principle. And you've got to shape it, right? So Proust is a big defender of the principle of sufficient reason, right? And the idea is it's got to be shaped in such a way that it avoids skeptical scenarios or undermines scientific practice or whatever. Like it's really important for epistemology, right? So it's got to be strong enough to, and of course, it's confirmed like just through inference to the best explanation too, right? So the principle of sufficient reason would say something like all contingent things have a cause. There's stronger formulations, right? That everything that's inherently causable has a cause, right? So it comes in different forms or different flavors. But I think the game that's generally played is to show that, hey, if you want a principle that's going to do real theoretical work, it's got to be at least strong enough that it's going to give you theism, right? Because it's going to wrap around all contingent natural things, right? And it's going to produce the result of some spooky entity, right? And then we can argue about how that spooky entity is God, right? So that's one way of kind of formulating contingency arguments, right? And a lot of the debate there focuses on kind of, I guess, two things, right? One is that principle, something like the PSR. And I say something like because for people who spent time in this know that there's formulations of PSR that are probably a bit too strong and that should be rejected, right? And then regress issues, right? Or whether you can satisfy the PSR with certain types of regresses. And generally, there's kind of two ways of dealing with regress issues, right? One is to say that it's irrelevant. The other is to say that at least in a relevant respect, it's impossible. Those are the two general ways of dealing with regress issues. It's irrelevant because if you think you need an explanation for why there's anything of the type contingent, then any one contingent thing is posterior to the fact that there, is anything of the type contingent, right? So even if there are, infinite chains or lines or matrices or whatever, however you want to spell it, of contingent things, doesn't matter, right? You're still going to need that sort of necessary being or that spooky thing to explain it, right? So I actually think there's a good amount going for those types of arguments. Again, there's lots of different formulations. And there's lots of good philosophers, I think, doing interesting work on those types of arguments. And I would say those are kind of in a Leibnizian tradition, right? But then there's more, these require, and we could talk about this more in next time because it does require a lot more work. There's types of contingency arguments, or maybe call them more broadly cosmological arguments, right? That I think are very powerful, but they're very powerful within a particular metaphysic or system, right? So they're not as quite standalone-ish or independent as some of these other arguments. And of course, every philosophical argument is importing various assumptions that can always be queried and challenged, right? But For me, I will say that I first kind of became convinced of a sort of metaphysical system that seemed to explain a lot of things that I wanted to have explained to me. And then within that system, you have these types of arguments that push towards the existence of God. You can think of Aristotelian type arguments, the types of arguments that somebody like Thomas Aquinas would give, right, from constituent ontologies. Those tend to be a lot more complex, but I think they're also really hard to escape from once you're committed to kind of a certain metaphysical picture, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's what that's up to. I think, Ed, look, I always thought that those types of arguments were very strong when I first encountered them. The first book I ever read on natural theology was a book by Mortimer Adler called How to Think About God. And it's funny because he initially rejects Aquinas's arguments, and then he gives a sort of a Leibnizian argument. So I kind of veered down that path for a while. But then as I got more into the metaphysical matters, I think Adler was wrong to reject the arguments that he rejected, and I've kind of veered back in the other direction. But at the end of the day, I think they're both pretty persuasive paths, and I think to escape the arguments is particularly costly, right? And at the end of the day, like, what more can we do, right, when it comes to philosophy? A lot of times we just have to make cumulative cases for each of the steps in the argument, and you show what the costs are for trying to escape them at various points. So when I think about, okay, what would it cost me to really get out of this type of argument? Personally, they're not the types of things that I feel I can accept, right?
Yeah. So what would be your sort of brief, and I know you have to go in a minute, so whenever you have to
Yeah.
go, what would be your sort of brief elevator pitch for, like, okay, a person says, okay, everything needs an explanation. There has to be something necessary. Why think that it's God or something like God?
Yeah, that's good. And this is where I think there's pros and cons to the different arguments, right? I think if you kind of do like a metaphysically neutral argument, you've got a lot more work, right? So say you just kind of, justify a PSR that wraps around contingent things, and then you've got the result of a necessary being. How do you get to God from there? Well, this is a lot of the literature of what is now become called like stage 2 of cosmological reasoning, right? And I think that William Rowe was the first guy who introduced that division, because it is obviously quite legitimate to ask, well, why think that necessary being is God, right? And there's moves there. There's lots of different moves that people make. Some of them are abductive, some of them are attempts at deductive arguments. I think those are kind of promising, but let me give you the approach that I think is a little bit better. I think it's better if you do the sort of metaphysical work up front, so you don't worry about trying to produce an entirely metaphysically neutral argument for the existence of God. So let me give just a quick sketch of what Aquinas is up to. And now you're going to see a whole bunch of controversial metaphysical commitments come into place. But I'll show you, I think, if you have these commitments in place, how you can show that that the ultimate being is God, and how actually you get an explanation for the necessity, not just trying to argue why the necessary being is God. And I think that's important, right? So Aquinas generally holds a metaphysic that is a constituent ontology. He thinks that familiar everyday objects have the character they do because they're comprised of different metaphysical parts, right? Following Aristotle, he thinks things have form and matter. But also on a deeper level, he thinks things are comprised of an essence element and an existence element, right? He thinks that this is a real distinction, right? That the essence of various contingent things does not demand their existence into reality. So existence is a first level property for Aquinas. Controversial commitment, has been for a long time. I think it's really actually well defended by thinkers like Barry Miller and Bill Vallicella and other people in the recent literature. But I won't get into that now. And Aquinas would say something like this: hey, given that, the existence of this cat, right, is not something that is explained by the principles intrinsic to its nature, namely its essence, it then becomes sort of quite legitimate to ask, well, why is it here at all? Not even in terms of like what brought it into existence, but why does it even exist at all, right? Because he thinks there's a sort of mutual dependence relation between the essence and existence of any being like a cat, right? And he thinks that this sort of mutual dependence relation is pointing to something beyond, say, the cat or the dog or whatever, right? This sort of funds the unity of the constituents, right? That imparts actuality into the essence element, which for those who follow Aristotelian metaphysics, right, essence and existence relate as potency to act, right? So there's a whole system here at play. But long story short, if you think you can walk that path, Aquinas is going to say, well, to get to the ultimate explanation of why there are any of these sort of essence existence composites, you got to get to something that really does have existence in virtue of what it is. And he's going to argue that this is a being that has no bounding essence, no finite or restricting sort of, yeah, I think bound is the best way to put it on its existence. So it would be a being that just is pure existence. So for Aquinas, existence isn't like a thin element or a thin property. It's a maximally rich property. He would think that essence and existence relate to bound and that which is bounded, that existence is what sort of breathes actuality into whatever a thing is and all the properties that it has, right? It's a very rich and thick ontology. But he's going to argue that, okay, well, once you have that as the fundamental reality, along with other principles, you're going to have certain sort of commitments that tumble out of this, right? Necessarily. One is that the being is going to be a being of pure actuality, because the potency element is sort of pushed out, if you will, right? And Aquinas is also committed to the classical theory of convertibility or transcendentals, where he thinks things like goodness and truth are just aspects of being, right? So we say goodness just is being under the aspect of perfection or desirability or what have you, right? It's nothing over and above being. It's just when something actualizes its species-specific potency, it's perfected and good to that extent, right? I think that's a fairly common sense understanding of goodness, actually. But long story short, if that's true, then a being that is purely actual, doesn't have any potencies to realize, has no privations, it will just turn out that it's purely good. Doesn't mean that it's good in the way that a tree is good or a human being is good. It's just whatever this thing is, it's going to be something that's perfectly good. He thinks it'll also have to be unique, because as a being that is subsistent existence, he thinks that to have any sort of multiplication here would actually contradict its nature, right? It would contradict it as either simple or subsistent. So he thinks that there's a good argument for a sort of in principle uniqueness there. He thinks that it would have to be omnipotent, because in virtue of being sort of uniquely unique, it's the thing that everything else that is a metaphysical composite would ultimately depend on, right, for its existence, right? So it is responsible for actualizing whatever possibilities of being are actualized, and so on and so forth, right? He can kind of go down the chain of the different like traditional divine attributes. And this is a hasty sketch, but I guess the point I would want to make is this. It's like, where do you want to do the heavy lifting in your kind of reasoning for God? I think if you do more heavy lifting up front with the metaphysics and you get a certain metaphysical system in place, and you work through difficult stuff initially, you can get, I think, a more robust argument for God that gives you a richer conception of God. Or you might be able to kind of like make it a little bit easier up front and like get to a necessary being. But then I think you're going to have a harder time of like really like demonstrating that that being is God, or that it's possessed of the traditional divine attributes. And for some people, that might not be a concern, because people debate over the divine attributes. My natural tendency is, because I'm not just interested in the question of God, I'm interested in the question of the entire structure of reality, that I've always been kind of interested in the metaphysics anyways. And then I see the upshot being is once that's in place, it kind of affords you a richer overall conception. Sorry, that was a lot in a little bit of time, but I hope it made a little bit of sense.
Yeah, no worries. No, I think that made sense. And I think, yeah, I agree that when you sort of buy into more of Aristotelian metaphysics, you can get a richer conception. I guess I think that sort of like, if you accept that there's a necessary thing who sort of exists by its own nature, it becomes very hard to see how naturalism is compatible with that, where it's like, it seems like the thing that exists by its own nature that's necessary, like that couldn't just be like a chair or like a particle.
Oh, I'm with you. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think a naturalist should be happy about the result of a necessary reality. It's just that a number of them actually do kind of accept that stage one reasoning, right?
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is that that results in really weirdly restricted modality, where, like, suppose that you think that you follow Graham Oppie, for instance, and you say what's necessary is, the initial state of the universe with certain laws. That means, for example, that Newtonian laws are impossible. Newtonian laws don't seem impossible. Surely there could have been Newtonian laws. And so, yeah, I think once you get this picture where, like, fundamental reality exists necessarily, it sort of exists by its own nature, then it just fits so much better with a theistic picture and then with a naturalistic picture.
Yeah, no, I agree, right? And the idea then also is that, like, from the Aristotelian perspective, right, you get God's necessity and virtue of being purely actual, right? Granted, controversial metaphysics, a whole nother discussion. And I guess, like, there's other ways of moving from, like, could you have, multiple truly necessary beings? I don't know. That's tough to think about without the wider metaphysics. I mean, maybe not, right? Because then one would have a feature that the other had or didn't have, right? And in which sense it's contingent. So, like, where's the necessity there, right? You know what I mean? But
wait, sorry, what I don't know if I followed that.
Yeah,
one would have to have
right. So if you have, like, a truly necessary being, right? Could you have multiple instances of it? That's the question. And I'm trying to think about whether the answer is yes or no, apart from some, like, deeper, commitment to a metaphysical system, right? I don't think different locations would work, because I think locations assume already different substances, right? So there has to be, like, some sort of feature, I think, that differentiates them. And maybe it's even indiscernible. I don't think you need to be committed to I. I mean, like, if there's two different things, and trivially so, there's a difference between them, right? Yeah. And you can't say that it's necessary if one lacks it, right? I don't know. It's just something that people can think about. I'm just trying to think about, if you're just moving from necessity to God, there's certain things that a lot of theists are going to want to say, right? That there's just one. I think that's something that a lot of theists want to say. And of course, you can always just, like, do general appeals to Occam's razor. But I think theists generally want to say something stronger than that. I think they want to say it's not just happenstance that there's one God, right? It has to be the case that there's one God. There's something that just metaphysically necessary about that. I think theists also generally want to say, and should say, that God has the full suite of traditional divine attributes as well. So yeah, you could always, like, make appeals to simplicity and stuff like that, but I'm just trying to think aloud of, again, for these kind of, like, more metaphysically neutral. And I know there's literature on this. I just haven't spent as much time in that area of people who try to, move from necessity to perfection, right? Or necessity to divinity. So I agree with you that even just the initial positive necessity should make a naturalist uncomfortable. Yeah, but I'd be curious your thoughts of what other moves you think can be made from there.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, so I'm not a classical theist, but I think this is one place where classical theism has an advantage. Where if you think that God is just, like, pure existence or something, well, like, you can't have there be multiple pure existences, right? Like, you right, like, if God just is existence, well, there's only one just existence, right? You can never.
Yeah, I know. I think Aquinas' argument is decisive for God's uniqueness, assuming that metaphysic, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm with you. And look, I'll happily grant as well that there's a lot of spooky stuff that comes with that understanding of God, right? But I like that, Matthew. I like the spooky stuff, man, because I just do, right? If God is, like, too similar to us, I get nervous, because I think that we're just inadequate in certain ways, right? So I think that there has to be something about God where we can approach him in the threefold way, the way of eminence, negation, and causation, where we can have we can make true predications about God, but we still really don't know what the hell we're talking about at the end of the day. I'm actually more comfortable with that view than other views of God that just seem to bring him. I don't like to be polemical and say, like, like a super being. Clearly it's not.
Yeah, I like the David Bentley Hart line about, well, the theistic personalists make God out to be some sort of Zeus character.
Yeah, and me and him are on one mind there. He really, really does not like theistic personalism, but he's also a guy that I think also likes to dwell on that kind of mystery of classical theism.
I mean,
right?
he's known for saying very mean words about people who disagree with him on watching.
Yeah, to say the least, right? But his
there's
experience of God book is really an interesting book. I really enjoyed that one. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a like 7-minute YouTube video of just that's titled just David Bentley Hart's best roasts, and a lot of them are really funny. He was, I think, talking about Dawkins, and he said, he was talking about some argument he made, and he said, this might be the single worst argument in the entire history of human thought. And he said, watching this man do philosophy is a bit like watching a dolphin tap dance.
Yeah, he's kind of like the Christopher Hitchens of the theists, like just really witty and polemical. I think he's obviously a lot more philosophically astute, but yeah, his polemics I try to ignore him a lot of times, but because I think a number of his considerations are actually really good and strong, but sometimes you can just like get lost in his prose, which is really impressive. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something to like about, I mean, on my picture, right, I don't think God is very much like us, right? I think what God is essentially, rather than something like unlimited being or something, I think God is just an unlimited mind, right? So an unlimited mind, consciousness, it's a very simple thing, right? It's non-composite. And then consciousness without limit. Well, if he didn't know stuff, that would be a limit on the mind. If he didn't, he couldn't do something, that would be a limit on the mind, and so on. So I think he's very unlike us, right? What is an unlimited mind like? I don't know. Like, I don't know in various ways. I mean, really awesome, right? Because, he'd be perfectly good on account of knowing all the moral facts and having no contrary psychological inclinations. So for the sort of Swinburne reasons, he'd be perfectly good.
Swinburnian, yeah.
Yeah. And he'd be by, the most fascinating conceivable being, right? Like we're these like limited minds and we don't know very much, and yet still relationships between humans are of immense value. God is, just infinitely far above us, right? So I think God is in various ways very mysterious and infinitely valuable and so on.
I agree with all that for sure.
Yeah. But I don't know. I mean, that I find, the things classical theists say, there is something to like, there is something appealing about it, where it does make more sense of the sort of absolute uniqueness of God. And maybe, if they're right, God's even simpler than I think of God, where it's like God doesn't even he has even fewer properties than I thought, where God just is. God is essentially that which is, or something. It's very
God has no properties for the classical theist.
Right.
So, none that imply any intrinsic passive potency, right? You can make contingent attributions of God for a classical theist, right? That God is creator is a contingent attribution. So there's a whole metaphysics that informs that. But it also is the case that classical theists, here's some of the spooky stuff, say that whatever God's knowledge is God's power, is God's goodness, right? How do you make sense of that? I think you make sense of it with the idea of a limit case, right? And a limit case is something which stands outside a particularly ordered series. So think of decreasing speeds, right? And then a standstill, right? A standstill is clearly that which towards the series converges, but it's not a member of that series, right? So there's some sort of distinguishing property or whatever that's sort of dialed to the point of extinction. Think polygons ordered to a circle, right? A circle's not a member of that series. It's the limit case of the series. So classical theists tend to say that, okay, whatever God's power is, it's the limit case instance of power. Whatever God's knowledge is, it's a limit case instance of knowledge. Whatever God's goodness is, it's a limit case instance of goodness. So even if you have trouble thinking about power and knowledge as we know it or we experience being identical, there's no reason to think that the limit case instance isn't identical. And that wherever there are these limit case instances, they might all converge to one being that just has different aspects, right? Maybe you have an aspectival account or something like that, right?
Yeah. I mean, I find it hard to make sense of the idea that what things approach as they get more powerful is the same as what things approach as they get more knowledgeable. Like, I don't know, when like what it seems like things approach as they get more powerful is being able to do more stuff. So the limit case is they can do an infinite amount.
They can produce more with less. So right, we think that things are more powerful to the extent they can produce more with less. Maybe the limit case is something that can produce anything at once with no prior material at all, right? And then we think that, maybe a sort of knowledge that might be a limit case instance of knowledge is a knowledge that is entirely active rather than passive, something like that, right?
I mean,
so I think
that just doesn't seem like it's a being who knows everything, even if their knowledge is passive in the sense that they just sort of sit around knowing stuff. That seems like the limit case of knowledge, right? Just like
No, I think passivity is the thing that has to be extinguished to the point of distinction to get a limit case. And think about this, right? If God has sort of passive knowledge, right? We want a mechanism, right? I think we want a mechanism of God's reliable cognitive contact with the world. How does God know he's not a brain in the vat? These are things we should be thinking about, right? And I don't think just saying God is perfect gives us a good explanation of that, right?
Yeah, right. I agree. You don't want to get God's properties from perfection. I think you want to get them from being an unlimited mind, right? So on account of him being an unlimited mind, he knows all things, right? And he has sort of direct awareness to things. So in a similar way to how you have direct awareness of your mental states, God has direct awareness of all facts. And then that can account. And then that's just one property where we can get, all the other properties that he has, I think fall out of that one. Your statement about how, I think there's one property and you think there are none, it does remind me of when atheists are saying, I just believe in one God fewer than you do.
I just believe in one property less than you, right?
Yeah, think about all the properties. We all reject God having, all these, composite parts and so on. I just go one further.
Yeah, the things that I like here, and these are all really good thoughts. Let me just a few more, and then we can wrap up here, and we'll do like a part two, right? Is that if you're a classical theist, I think you are committed to the idea. I mean, you have a mechanism, right? That God's knowledge is executive, right? That the contact is actually causal. God knows what the case is because he's actively bringing it about. He's not like scanning with an infallible organ. Now that invites issues, right? If God's actively, causing everything to come about, how do you make sense of human free will and stuff like that? And that's something that classical theists have thought about for a very long time. And I think there's decent accounts of that. I think, Matthews Grant is a philosopher I like a lot. And he's got a whole book on God's universal, Matthews, universal causality, right? And human freedom. So, like everything else, there's trade-offs, right? Like sometimes philosophy is like politics. You think you're solving one problem, you're creating another, right? But at the end of the day, when I weigh it all up, I like the classical theistic model for ultimate explanation and for giving me enough room of spookiness where this is more of a personal note, Matthew, where there's a room for a certain hope where for various issues that I otherwise am not entirely sure how to resolve, right? And the hope sort of lies in the transcendence, in the mystery. I don't know, maybe that's just me getting old or lazy. But that's one of the appeals of the kind of more classical theistic picture to me. If that makes sense.
There's definitely there's something to be said for it, and it can explain. It explains, and one thing it explains nicely is what's so special about God. Why God can't make other beings that are as great as him. God, it just is perfect being or something. Then like God isn't just a good thing. He isn't just a thing when you take goodness to the max. God is goodness itself. Then it can explain, okay, what's so special about God? Why God is uniquely worthy of relationship and better. Okay, I think there's something attractive about it. I mean, I'm not far from classical theism, right? I don't think that God has parts. I think God has just one core fundamental property, maybe none, right? I think people like Joshua Sijuwade, they say God's a trope or something, where he's like,
God. I've been back and forth with Joshua on that one, but he thinks God's just an omnipotence trope, right?
Yeah, and I think maybe God's like an unlimited mind trope or something, or like an unlimited agency trope, or maybe an omnipotent, something along those lines. So I think.
We're close. I think we're close, man. And by the way, Roku, not to interrupt, but did you see my chat with Josh about that recently?
I did not. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, I pushed him a little bit. Josh is brilliant. I love Josh. He's such a good guy. But he defends sort of essentialism and Aristotelianism, and I'm like, my man, how is this consistent with your commitment to trope theory, right? Because these things are not the same, right? Trope theory is in certain ways a competitor to traditional essentialism and Aristotelianism. And his response is very clever. He thinks in his worldview there's just one trope. It's just God. It's the only trope. It's the only trope.
Yeah, I think, and to be clear, I'm not super wedded to the trope thing. Like, I think what I think is bad news is if you say God is like here's a bad option. a bad deal is if you say, look, what fundamental reality looks like is there's a mind and it has three properties: omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence. There's no deeper explanation of why it has those three. Maybe that's a better view than naturalism still, but like, it's like, okay, there's a thing with three properties. Too many things. You want just one thing from which all the properties flow. So like an unlimited mind, or as Swinburne suggests, like an unlimited agent, where it's like, it's an agent of the simplest kind. It's just unlimited in the things that, what is true of agents, it possesses all those to the max, and that's very simple. Or like maybe it's a trope or something. I accept that. I don't think God has parts. Where I get suspicious, when people start talking about God being his essence, being his existence, or him being the same thing as his attributes, that's when I reach for my gun. That's when I get suspicious.
That's right. Yeah, and look, if you're gonna I understand, because when I first encountered those things, I'm like, what the hell is this, right? And it's going to depend on whether you accept, I think, a number of other commitments, right? One is like the broad, not just Aristotelian, because Aristotle didn't have the essence existence distinction. Perhaps Plotinus did, if you follow Lloyd Gerson, right? It's there definitely with Aquinas, and he thinks that this is actually like really important to do a lot of metaphysical work. And then also these convertibility principles, right? You're going to need that. So I'm not saying it's an easy thing. I certainly don't think it is. I think it flows nicely downstream from other commitments, and then once you have it, it's just a really nice picture of God. And then I think the other issues that it invites concerning libertarian freedom or modal collapse, I think those can be dealt with. At least certainly as well as how other models of God tend to deal with these types of issues. So like everything else, right? There's just a lot that goes on, and it's hard. Think about God's hard, man. It's hard work, man. It's hard. Yeah, man. Let's definitely do a part 2, man. I've this has been awesome. I'm sorry I can't go for like 4 hours today.
No worries at all.
I have a massively pregnant wife and 5 children.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you, dude. Yeah, she's due. She's 8 months pregnant right now. So
are you Wait, do you have other kids?
Yeah, I got 5.
Wow, that's a lot. It's more than I have.
0. Yeah. Where can people find you? Keep up with your work and all that good stuff for my audience.
So you can find me at my house, but no. You can. Yes, you can find. I have a blog at benthams.substack.com, or if you just Google Bentham's Bulldog or Bentham's newsletter, it should be the first thing that you find. I started it when I was a hedonic utilitarian. I'm still a utilitarian. They're not. I now think there are lots of intrinsic goods for a person, not just pleasure. Also relationships and stuff. So yeah, that's behind the name. So you can find me there. I have a YouTube channel called Deliberation Under Ideal Conditions, which, I think the blog's better than the YouTube channel generally. So that's where you can find me. I guess I'll upload this on my channel. So where can people find you?
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. This has been a really great discussion. They can find me also on Substack, the Journal of Absolute Truth. Self-reviewed, very rigorous, philosophy of religion journal.
You'll find absolute truth there, I've heard.
Yeah, absolute truth. I'm like, what's a modest name? There's an inside joke related to that that's not funny, so I won't tell it. And then Philosophy for the People on YouTube and iTunes, so they can check me out there. Matthew, it's been a joy, my man.
Yeah, thanks for this has been a lot of fun, and I'm excited to talk again.